Welcome back. This lecture is beginning our little sub unit on moral nativism. The question is morality innate or is it something that's learned? And Paul Bloom here argues that morality is innate, although he admits that we don't quite have all the evidence and all the support for that claim. So it would be nice if before we talked about whether morality is innate, we could define what it means for something to be innate. But that is a whole debate in philosophy and psychology on its own. Um, so I don't expect to resolve that today. So let's say, as a rough sketch, innate means not learned from the environment. Um, so John Locke, for example, a philosopher from the 1700s, claimed that our minds are blank slates at birth, right? Um, no one thinks that's the case. No one thinks these days that everything is learned, right? Some things are probably. For example, Chomsky prominently argued that there is some sort of innate basic linguistic ability in humans, right? There's some sort of underlying grammar that it has to be triggered by the environment because obviously not everyone speaks the same language in adulthood, and often natural languages are very different, right? Some involve like clicks, and some involve, a lot of them have sounds that aren't in other languages. Um, but he thinks there's a core linguistic ability, core sort of grammar that manifests in different ways, and that is innate. Uh, there might also be evidence from developmental psychology where they study for very young infants that there's some rudimentary concepts of causation and like numerosity, like the ability to say between one and two and stuff like that, might also be innate. By contrast, the rules of baseball is an example of something that is not innate, right? You have to be exposed to baseball to know about baseball. No one is born understanding baseball. So if morality at some level is innate in the way that, Chomsky thinks language is, we should expect it to show up, right, in every different culture in more or less the same way. We should see a lot of basic similarities um, in the moral codes of different cultures. Obviously, there's room for difference, just like there are different languages, but right, there should be a common core to morality across humanity. Uh, so Jesse Prince, he's a philosopher who engages a lot in cognitive science and psychology. He's argued that morality is not innate um, because he argues morality is not universal. There's too much difference in the moral codes um, in different cultures. So, he takes, for example, if you thought one thing that you might think would be a universal moral claim would be something like harming other people is bad. And we saw an earlier paper that argued that, yeah, harm is sort of the most basic part of morality. But the Prince goes on to say, well, even that claim, if anything's basic, that would probably be basic. But actually, look, we harm people all the time and animals, and actually often think it's a good thing, right? And we mentioned this in the previous lecture too. We go to movies, right? And we watch the good guy kill the bad guy, and we all go, yes, right? We feel great about it, and we think it's a good thing. Good thing to kill in self-defense, right? Sometimes it's a good thing to go to war, right? It's for a good cause. Many of us eat and, given the way the factory farming system works, essentially torture animals and don't seem to have any moral problem with it. Some of us do have a moral problem with it, and so on. There's plenty of harm that goes on, and we think it's perfectly good. Uh, I was, when I was a child, my parents thought it was the morally right thing to spank me. Spanking is less popular now. Maybe I don't know if any of you got spanked as children, but people still do it, right? And they think when they do it, they don't think, oh, this is such a bad thing. No, they think I must do this to help my child. This is moral, right? So, like Prince's point being, harm is frequently thought of as good. And of course, Prince is right on that point. Nativist doesn't have to therefore accept that morality is not innate, right? All they have to do is say, well, nobody said that the moral principle was don't harm. That's too simplistic, right? Of course, sometimes you have to harm, right? I mean, any species that never harmed anything wouldn't last too long in the world, right? You have to have some sort of means for defense and sometimes some means for aggression if you were a, carnivore or an omnivore. So the principle has to be a little more subtle, right? Even if it's innate and it's evolved, it's going to be more subtle than that. It's going to allow for at least self-defense and things like that. Bloom doesn't try to tell us what the innate principle is as regards harm, right? But certainly he thinks it would probably allow for more harms the further away someone is genetically or geographically from your in group. Right? So it would probably be something where it's like not okay to harm your close friends, but maybe it is okay to harm an aggressor from another tribe, right? Something like that. It should probably make allowances for harming children if they need that for to be corrected or to be saved or something like that. So it's going to be a little more complicated than don't ever harm. Now Prince has thought of this, right? He's a good philosopher, and his response is, okay, well if the moral principle involved is not as simple as don't harm and it's something more complicated, then really what's more plausible, right? Is this complicated moral principle something we learn, right, using our rational brains, or is it something that evolved? How complicated can an innate evolved moral principle be? Um, and, look at society, right? Any functioning society would need some sort of prohibition on violence, right? You can't just have indiscriminate violence in a big, complicated, uh, but they would need to allow violence to protect the community, right? Violence against criminals, violence against invaders, and so on. So yeah, that principle is going to like develop in any society, right? That seems like a very plausible um, story about how this, semi sort of complicated rules about harm come to be. Um, it would have to be innate, and it doesn't seem to be the most plausibly innate, according to Prince. And there is some evidence that your moral codes um, they vary across societies, and the reason is that there's different conditions in different societies, right? So um, honor societies, like the ancient Greeks, right, which allowed for much more violence, your honor and stuff, they develop when there's not really a central authority, right? When it was an early sort of more democratic sort of system, but also a little more chaotic, and so there was more room for more violence. There had to be more leeway for more violence. So the idea is, look how plausible this story is, right? How the prohibition on harm will evolve as societies evolve, right? Instead of being an innate thing that's born into humans. But on the other side, now, in favor of the claim that morality is innate, we note that moral codes are actually pretty slow. They kind of lag behind the social condition, right? Um, so it's not necessarily the case that morality is sort of a direct result of the state of your society, right? The nature of your society. It tends to be actually a little bit more primitive than your society is, right? Just look at our society now. Um, we're a lot more violent and vengeful and sort of like resemble the Greeks much more than we need to in this kind of the kind of country and society we find ourselves in now, where there's really very a deal of centralized authority. Right? You can call the cops anytime that you need help with that stuff. There's really no need to be quite as violent as we tend to be. We also do tend to be fairly tribal and small-minded. I have a picture of the Brexit thing, right? So, like, the people in the UK decided, oh, we don't want to be part of the EU. We want British people and we want the advantage, whatever. Not to you have any, not to get political, right? But it is sort of a protectionist, all this stuff for us kind of mindset. And it's not clear that that's really adaptive trait in a global economy like ours, right? Brexit didn't really work out so well for the British, it seems, right? Again, not to get political, um, But this sort of tribalism seems to be lagging a bit behind the actual social conditions and what's actually to your advantage these days, right? So a lot of these sort of a lot of our innate responses, or a lot of our responses, our moral codes, less like us rationally keeping up with conditions and doing the rational thing given the society we're in, and instead they look a little bit more like something left over from evolution that's a little behind the times and kind of slow to adapt. Bloom claims, right? Against so, um, how do we study, right? How could we figure this out? Well, there's some ways to study this question. Often we'll study primates, right, which are our nearest evolutionary ancestors. So if they seem to share any of the same moral templates as us, that might suggest that yeah, morality is innate. We'll also study child development, right? So if you can catch children very early before they've learned very much, if they demonstrate any moral behavior, you can say, well, it wasn't learned, right? They don't know much yet, so that must have been innate. So moral babies and chimps. Um, Here's just some evidence for moral nativism. It's been shown that infants are so infants, we're talking about little babies, right? Definitely less than a year. Uh, and they seem to be sensitive to distress in others. So if another baby is crying, that they're more likely to cry. And when they develop enough coordination to do so, they will often attempt to soothe other people that seem to be in distress. This also is the case with other primates. Chimpanzees, but notably not monkeys, also engage in behavior, hand on the back, hand on the shoulder kind of thing, when conspecific just means another um, is in distress, right? So if they see another chimp in distress, they'll try to comfort. Um, Toddlers will often uh, be surprisingly sort of altruistic in their behavior for how young they are. Toddlers, we're talking, um, so they like to help. Right? So an adult trying to find an object, toddler will help even if you don't ask them to help. Um, so with all this evidence, right? If you're Jesse Prince, you will come up with clever ways to explain, right, what's going on with the chimps and what's going on with the babies, and you might explain it in a non-moral way. Um, and it comes down to the question, well, which is more plausible, right? So back to sort of the relationship between morality and rationality, right? So if you're not a nativist, well, morality sort of developed as a rational response, right? Um, David Hume, who was sort of around this time of Locke, uh, famously argued that morality cannot be equivalent to rationality because he says you cannot derive ought from is. Ought is like, moral normative claims. You should do this, you shouldn't do that, right? Is like descriptive claims, the way the world is. And Hume says the two are independent. Another famous quote is, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger," right? Because that's not irrational. Why would that not be irrational? Because all logic and reason does, it helps you effectively reach your goals, but it's not going to tell you what your goals are, right? So it doesn't tell you what to care about and what matters to you. So if you care very much about your finger and very little about the world, right, the whole rest of the world, that's logic, right? Has nothing to say about that, right? That's just your own uh, values, right? So for anything like mature morality to get going, right? If we believe Hume here, there has to be some sort of innate mechanism, not a purely rational mechanism. Uh, Something that gets you to care about others and want to eliminate their suffering and help them in people in need. Reason alone is not going to make you care about others. So something, these basic, and Hume thought it was an emotional thing. It was distinct from reason. So these, if he's right, these simple emotions are a necessary seed for the development of morality. And, reason can enhance your moral behavior, right? The smarter you are, the better you are at being moral, right? You can, our example from a previous lecture, you can think about which charity to donate and the very best one using the reason. But, according to this Humean view, um, reason alone can't do it, right? Some kind of basic other thing, some kind of emotion. Okay, so back to the chimps, right? We saw that they spontaneously act in ways that seem, on the face of it, like moral behavior. Um, they also make moral judgments about other people. So part of morality is judging things to be good or bad. Well, in pre-verbal infants, right, that can't talk to us and tell us what their judgments are, we use their looking behavior as a measure of sort of their interest and what they're up to, what they're thinking about. So, for example, 3 to 5 month-year-olds, uh, 3 to 5 month olds uh, prefer looking at scenarios in which characters help each other rather than like hinder or hurt each other, right? A block, and if the other puppet helps, the infant is very interested in this. If the other puppet is knocking the block out of the puppet's hands, they don't really want to look at that. And if you let them reach for the puppets, they tend to reach for the helping puppets, right, and not the hindering puppets. Jump up to 21-month-olds, right? So now we're like a year and a half, almost 2 years old. Uh, they're given an opportunity to give a treat to either character, right? And they tend to prefer to give treats to the good guys. Ask If they ask the 20-month-old, 21-month-old to take a treat away from one of the characters, they'll take it from the bad guy. And finally, if there's a scenario where they show the bad guy being punished, uh, they still, right, now we're back to 8 month olds. If you ask them now, which puppet do you want to play with? They want to play with the Punisher, right? Even though the Punisher was just involved in a harmful act, they seem to understand that he's harming a bad guy, and they like the good guy, and that it's okay to harm bad guys, right? So it's a fairly complicated uh, calculation they seem to be making here, and it seems to be, on the face of it, a moral judgment. But of course, right, we need to be put on our critical thinking hats. Is this really evidence of morality? Is there some other explanation? Well, first of all, I mean, isn't it just good sense to want to hang out with helpers and avoid hinderers, right? I mean, that's just self-interest. Even, we talked about psychopaths before. So those are people that just don't really have any moral feelings, right? And you know, serial killers are like this. And are also psychopaths that walk around uh, everyday life and don't kill people, and they just really can't really get morality very well. Right? They can get by understanding what the rules are, right? So as long as they understand the rules and they can stick to the rules, but they're not really getting morality, right? Um, but even if you were like that, you might still figure out that you want to hang out with helpful people, right? That would be good for you. So what we really need to know is whether the infants like the helpers, or do they think that they are morally good, right? And certainly the two can come apart. So, I can be annoyed when doing something that I know is morally good, right? If my friend who drove me to the bar says, I got too many drinks, drive, we got to call a cab, and I don't have the money, and I might be annoyed. I think, it's only a few blocks, right? So you can see how, like, like, someone can inconvenience you, but you can agree, okay, it's morally right, right? We're not the same thing. Um, Another point in favor of a moral interpretation is that, remember, the infants themselves were not helped by these characters, right? They were watching these characters interact with each other, and one helps the other, and they like to help. But at the very least, it's not immediate self-interest. Um, Again, a critic might say they just they might know that eventually it would be in their self-interest to hang out with this helpful person. Right? Who knows? I mean, the other thing is, like, there's not really a clear line between moral and pro-social helping behavior, right? If you look at evolutionary accounts of morality, they typically say, yeah, but right, morality evolved because, right, helping behavior, pro-social behavior is good for, the species, right? So there's not really even necessarily a bright line to be drawn here. Um, but Again, so we're asking sort of what's more plausible. There's more work to be done, right? More studies to be done. Whatever side you're on, you will find a way to explain this data probably. Um, Another little data point in favor of the innate view is that the emotions expressed by these infants when they're in these studies are similar to the adult emotions with moral judgments. In adults, we can tell whether it's an actual moral judgment because we can ask them, right? Hey, are you, do you think this person is just nice and you would like to hang out with them, or do you think they are morally good? Um, and when we get the moral answer from adults, uh, associated with emotions of, disapproval, concern, anger, right? When they're making a moral judgment that something is bad. And the infants seem to be expressing similar emotions, right? So, you know, just a little bit more evidence that what they're doing is maybe actually making more judgments. Okay, so supposing morality is innate, right? What does it look like, right? Is it so, back to Chomsky, right? He says, yeah, there's an innate universal grammar that explains the linguistic abilities of young children. And the evidence from this in linguistics is in part our broad agreement on, right? So even if you don't know the rules of grammar, or can't explain them, right, you'll still typically get the answers right. If I ask you, is this sentence grammatical? John seemed sleeping. You'll say no. That feels weird. It's not grammatical, right? You can't actually say why. You don't know what the rules are. Maybe because the rules were in you before you were born. They were innate. So there's a similar phenomenon with moral intuitions. Um, right? People do tend to agree on cases, right? So, for example, these trolley problems, um, or there's all sorts of variations. One is, right, there's the train going on the track, it's going to run over 5 people, but you could pull the lever, go to another track and just kill one, right? Would you pull the lever? Most people say, yeah. Give them another scenario, which is pictured up here on the right. Here you got to, so they call them trolley problems because it's not like a full-on big train, it's a smaller trolley. The reason we're talking about a little trolley is that in this scenario, you're on a bridge overlooking the trolley to get about 5 people, and there's a real big guy next to you, and he's kind of leaning over to see what happens, and with a little push, knock him off, right? He'd land on the train track. The little trolley would hit him and kill him, but then it would stop. It wouldn't kill the 5 people. So the math is the same, right, as the pull the lever situation. Pull one to save 5, but this time instead of just pulling the lever, you got to literally push the guy off a bridge. And most people say, yeah, I pull the lever, but no, I wouldn't push the guy off the bridge, right? And there's been a lot of sort of ink spilled or puzzling over how to explain this difference, right? The math is the same, and yet people agree, yeah, I would do the one, that's okay, but no, it's immoral. Um, but the point is, that people do broadly agree, right, on each case what the right thing is to do, even if we don't know what the general rule is that would predict that, right? Just like, right, the universal grammar case. Everybody knows whether it's grammatical or not, even if they can't what the rule is that makes it grammatical or not grammatical. So there is some analogy here with, innateness, right? There's some disanalogies too. Um, the innate grammar for a language has got to be fairly complex, right? Um, if there are innate moral rules, they are probably nowhere near that complex, and they probably consist of like a few kind of heuristics. Harm is bad. Of course, we've already seen harm is bad. Can't be that simple, right? So how complex is it? Um, it's a tricky question. I mean, Haidt, for example, has put forward sort of 5 basic heuristics that he thinks might be innate, uh, or at least he claims exist in all humans, right? So these are harm and care, which we've seen. Harm broadly bad, caring for people broadly good, obviously with some exceptions. Fairness, uh, loyalty to your group, respect for authority, and purity, right? So these things about incest taboos or not eating rude kill, things like that. So, we've seen some evidence that infants seem to be interested in people, and seem to like care better than harm, right? That seems to emerge early in development. There does seem to be evidence that babies prefer characters that engage in fairness. So if you have, puppets distributing things equally like that, right, and they do expect reciprocation to a certain degree when they're sharing and stuff like that. They do also seem to be um, to demonstrate this in-group loyalty template, right? Sort of moral template where they do favor and act more fairly toward members of their own group, whatever that group may be, physical similarity, some other property, right? But they do sort of group and favor people from their groups. There's not a lot of data on the last two, authority, respect, and purity sanctity, at least in child development. It might be because those might emerge later in development, right? Does that mean they're not innate? Not necessarily. Often an innate mechanism does need a trigger. If you Even if you have an innate um, right capacity for language, no one ever teaches you a language at a certain point, right? It has to be triggered at a certain before a certain age, and after that, it's really hard actually for you to learn a language. So there might be, at certain stages, certain moral templates get triggered. So we've talked a bit about emotion, right? And according to Hume, emotion morality has to be based in emotion. It can't be based in reason, and that for him was the only other option. Um, and current psychologists, many of them have argued that emotions, even if they're not the whole story, they play an important role in moral judgments. Again, Hume was on one far side. He says morality is just emotions, right? Um, we saw Damasio, I mentioned him in a previous lecture, and Prince actually kind of agreed with Damasio on this point, which is that um, you need emotions in order to be able to make really judgments at all. We saw people with, certain types of brain damage that didn't damage their rational capacities, but they have sort of the gut feelings of the emotions that allowed them to get off the fence and make a decision, right? So emotion seems to play an important role in judgment and moral and kind of judgment, moral judgment. And again, there's some developmental evidence for this. We saw that, the babies involved in the experiments, right? If they were, if they're mad at a mean character, right? There was like the emotional, if they judged a character to be bad, right? You saw sort of anger in their face, frown at the bad characters, they smile at the good ones, and so on. Uh, those kinds of, that kind of data you have to be very careful with, right? So what you need is independent observers, right, to rate the emotional balance of the baby's expressions. Because if you're like a researcher and you know the whole point of the study, and then you're judging a baby's face and saying whether it's a frown or not, you can kind of fool yourself, right? So they need more careful studies with that stuff. And even if we do find a correlation between emotions and moral judgments, correlation is not causation, right? There's all sorts of reasons out there for the correlation. And in fact, it could be the other way around. A moral judgment of badness could cause, right, an emotion of anger or something like that. So, what role does reasoning play, right? If uh, there's no doubt, right, a mature sense of morality, as we find in an adult, is much more complicated than what we're seeing in these infants. Um, we're not. It's your conception of morality, and the one we'll teach in ethics class is typically not just for in-group members, right? We're not Nazis, right? We think that people that are very different from us deserve fairness, right? We should be able to do good deeds for them and so on. Uh, So where does that come from, right? It's a little more complicated than the innate mechanisms. Um, now you might argue that this expansion of the moral circle is simply a result of a globalized world, right? So, you we now have access. I drive a Japanese car, I drive a Subaru, right? If you enjoy Japanese films and you have much more exposure these days to other cultures, African culture, Indian culture, right? We can pull up those movies any day, right, from the internet, and get a fair amount of exposure, right? Limited, but better than you could, a couple hundred years ago to other cultures. So Maybe that's the reason that, our moral sense is expanded to include people that are different from us. But Bloom argues that that's not sufficient, right? Mere exposure, right? So, for example, um, slave owners in the American South, when slavery was legal, had plenty of contact with their slaves, right? It did not cause them to include them in the moral circle as deserving of fairness and equal treatment, right? And um, if you're one of those people that think animals or some animals are deserving of more care and respect, we give them people that work with animals every day in farms, right? Kill and potentially abuse in some of these, farms. Uh, those people don't seem to turn into vegans, right? So it's not clear that mere contact is to explain this broader view of morality. And simple heuristics, it's not clear they can explain more abstract notions of morality, right? If you thought that democracy is a morally superior form of government, um, surely that view is not innate. Right? So what is that process? Right? If some moral heuristics are innate, how does that move from these gut innate, probably emotional, coming from emotion, moral judgments to the more abstract, right, reasoned judgments? We don't get an answer here. Right? In fact, by the end of this article, you probably have more questions than answers, right? But at least you're given sort of the structure of the debate, right? What's at stake and what the data is and what you would have to say depending on what side you're on. Part of the reason I picked this article is not because it purports to give a clear answer, but does sort of give you a sense of how you would start to answer this sort of question about whether morality is innate. So we'll talk about it a little more in the next lecture.